Okay, so I looked in.
Yeah, okay. Folks, we'll get started in just a few minutes. We're good. Okay, if I could have your attention, please. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm Dr. Daniel Stewart of the History and Humanities program here at Fayetteville Tech, and today it's my honor to welcome you to the fall 2024 installment of the Community History Lecture Series. And this is another of the lectures we've done in partnership with the Lafayette Society of Fayetteville. We have an excellent guest speaker today, but before I introduce him, I'd first like you to give a warm welcome to our good friend and president of the Lafayette Society of Fayetteville, Miss Gwen Melton.
So thank you all so much for coming. I was allowed 60 seconds, and I'm going to use every one of them. So I am the president of the Lafayette Society, and we are so very proud of this society. This is not a genealogy organization. This is a historical organization where we're trying to educate everyone about the Marquis de Lafayette. As part of that, we are helping to promote lecture series here at this institution, as well as at Methodist University. We are also trying to make absolutely certain that all of our places of higher learning have endowments from the Lafayette Society. We're working on FTCC for 2025. So we are very, very, very interested in making sure that everyone and every citizen here understands about the Marquis de Lafayette. He was French, but he was a hero in both America and in France. And that's because of his magnificent ideals. He was a champion of human rights, women's rights. Everyone was considered equal, and he was an amazing military leader. Hoorah, 82nd Airborne. Yes, yes. So we are going to see him again here. He is coming to Fayetteville March 4th and 5th for the 200th anniversary of his bicentennial tour, 1824-1825. We can't wait to see him. Something's happening this weekend. How many of you can sing happy birthday? Okay, bring all of those voices and join the Lafayette Society members, friends, to come and celebrate his birthday, where we will be at First Presbyterian. Come rain or shine, there are going to be activities, raffles, oh yes, prizes, Lafayette themed prizes, and cupcakes. Yes, cupcakes. So we look forward to seeing you, and let's get ready to enjoy a magnificent lecture.
Okay, thank you, Gwen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Mark Trapp. Mark's a graduate of the University of Illinois and the Washington and Lee University Law School. Mark's an attorney in the great city of Chicago and the author of A Destiny of Undying Greatness, Kiffin, Rockwell, and the Boys Who Remembered Lafayette. Now, you may be wondering what inspired an officer of the courts to write an historical account of World War I aviators. But rather than elaborate on that myself, let's find out from Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big, warm Fayetteville welcome to our new friend and guest, Mark Trapp.
Thank you, everybody. I'm pleased to be here. I am Mark Trapp. I am an attorney. I am from Chicago. I hope that doesn't work against me. I should mention, I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Dan and Gwen, and I've got to thank Hank Parfit too for setting this whole thing up. I really appreciate it. Because I get to do my favorite thing, or one of my favorite things in the world. One of my favorite things is going on road trips with my family. I don't know, there's something about driving down the road with the kids and going different places. But another of my favorite things is talking about Kiffin, Rockwell, and the boys who remembered Lafayette, as I call them. And even better is that today I get to do that in Fayetteville and on the birthday of Lafayette. It's pretty amazing to have this opportunity. Like I said, I am from Chicago. I am an attorney. Quick story about when I first started law. I'm licensed to practice in North Carolina and South Carolina as well. I was thinking that might work for me. When I first started, I started down in Greenville, South Carolina, with a litigation firm down there, and I got down to Greenville and realized that Columbia was 100 miles away. I had never been down there, and that's where you take the bar prep course. And I was like, well, forget it. I'm not driving down there every day to try to take the prep course. I've been through 3 years of law school. If I can't pass the bar now, forget it. So I called the firm and said, you mind if I just start working? And they said, well, aren't you going to take the prep course? And I was like, it's down in Columbia. Like, no. And they were like, okay, well, yeah, I guess you can. So I ended up starting before the other associates. And I went in, and my very first day, I was standing by the elevator next to one of the secretaries. And the firm was called Leatherwood, Walker, Todd, and Mann. And it was a big litigation firm. And there were some old school gentlemen that were some of the best litigators in South Carolina. One of them was named J.D. Todd. And I met him right there that morning when he came out by the elevator, and he walked up towards me, and the secretary that was there says, Mr. Todd, this is our new associate, Mark Trapp. Come on over. And he walked over, and I was like, put out my hand, and he stood there and he said, where are you from? And I was like, I'm from Illinois, sir. I knew you weren't from around here. I was like, it's really nice to meet you. And she was like, oh, that's just how he is. And I was like, oh my gosh, they could smell the Yankee on me. I'm in big trouble. But like I said, I am licensed in North Carolina and South Carolina, and I did live in Greenville for 6 years, and so it's good to be back in the South too. We live in an age that prefers to forget. Those are the words of Gerald P. Boersma, a professor of theology at Ave Maria University, in a recent article that he wrote about the new memorial in Washington, D.C. to commemorate World War I and the contributions of America in that war. Referring to what he called the malaise of memory, or the will to forget, Professor Boersma continued, quote, today, the very notion of a collective memory, a shared identity, or a common life is met with deep suspicion. And so we live in an age that tears down its public monuments. We have seen too much evidence of this in recent years. Just this summer, unrestrained protesters in our nation's capital defaced statues of Lafayette and Rochambeau immediately across the street from the White House, scrawling and spray painting slurs such as, well, words that I can't or wouldn't repeat, but other words such as kill pigs, long live the Intifada, glory to the resistance, shame on you, Joe, things like that, painted across these statues. In a post on X, one supposed historian attempted to justify this nonsense, asserting that the vandals were actually, quote, evoking Lafayette's legacy of revolutionary resistance. Now, I don't know, I'm not the total expert on Lafayette, but I doubt that Lafayette would want his legacy to be spray painted graffiti and vulgarities on public monuments. As a society and world, we used to build great things. We used to celebrate great achievements in our public structures and monuments, such as the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, the Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore. They all served as permanent reminders, statements that we will remember, as Professor Boersma put it. And we had respect for greatness. We recognized and honored the best moments and traits in the imperfect people who had gone before us. Too often today, it seems that America's detractors want only to highlight and endlessly dwell on the country's perceived flaws and mistakes, rather than the manifest good that this nation and its people have achieved in the world and for mankind. They seek only to tear down rather than to build up. They do the same with every public figure, past or present, scrutinizing every word, every act, and every supposed flaw, until they find, or in many instances, manufacture something, some imperfection that can be exploited or used to drag that person down, to topple him or her like a mob topples a statue. It's as if an ugly guy such as myself somehow married Cindy Crawford, and then even as she works out, stays fit, cooks, cleans, brings home the supermodel dollars year after year, I sit on the couch, unemployed, eating Cheetos all day, getting uglier and more out of shape, all while spending my time focusing on and belittling her for the tiny mole above her left lip. But when we've torn down every statue and canceled every hero, to whom shall we look for honesty? To whom shall we look for truth? To whom shall we look for nobility, for idealism, for heroism? Only when no monuments or men are left standing will we realize to our regret that we're kicking out the legs of our own civilization, of our own future. I, for one, believe that the best traits, characteristics, and moments that we recognize and honor in those who have gone before are what can and should unite us. And that Kiffin, Rockwell, and the other boys who remembered Lafayette show us a path to unity. These boys were not perfect, as no one is, but in their best times, in their shining moments, they achieved greatness, a standard that even if we never meet it, is worthy of our aspiration. And how did they achieve greatness? Well, as you see, my book is titled The Destiny of Undying Greatness, Kiffin, Rockwell, and the Boys Who Remembered Lafayette. By remembering those who had done great things before them and raising themselves up through their deeds to meet that standard. The thought, the act of remembering precedes the action. That is why we have monuments. That is why we have heroes. That is why we have history books and lectures like this, to remember. Now, I won't say that every single monument that's ever been put up and ever been placed in a public square deserves to stay there forever and ever, amen. But we should not have roving mobs of folks traipsing through our cities and towns, tearing down statues, memorials, and monuments without thought or regard to what they are doing or who they are impugning. Remembering is how we can grow as a society and a civilization, by recognizing and understanding that the imperfect people who went before that we so easily and arrogantly criticize may actually have something to teach us. And when we remember greatness, we may be humble enough to seek to emulate it. We can, in that moment, in that thing, in that sphere, in that instance, in that situation, do something great ourselves. Even better, something good, something worthwhile. And so, as I write in the foreword of my book, come with me, come back to a time when men stood as men, when war raged across continents, and a boy named Kiffin became a hero worthy of our remembrance, a hero worthy of two flags. This is Kiffin Rockwell. I always like this photo of him. This is him at 17 years old when he was a student at Washington and Lee. And there's something about him in this photo. I always told everybody when I was in law school that there was three men that I would admit finding attractive. Kiffin Rockwell was one of them. Elvis Presley was the other one. And Ronald Reagan always had some kind of a look like, the sort of movie star kind of look. And I always thought that. But I don't think any of them top Kiffin Rockwell in this photo. He just looks noble. He looks like he's got a future, and he did have a future. Now, most Americans with a passing knowledge of history have heard of General Pershing's march through Paris on July 4th, 1917, with the newly arrived American troops to the tomb of Lafayette, where on behalf of America, Pershing's aide, Colonel Charles Stanton, uttered the famous words, "Lafayette, we are here." But too many are unaware of the actions and sacrifices of Kiffin Rockwell and other American boys dating back to the outset of the Great War, more than 2.5 years prior to that date. My own knowledge came about more by happenstance than anything else when, in the fall of 1997, I began law school at Washington and Lee University School of Law in Lexington, Virginia. On my first day, I took a walk around campus to familiarize myself with my new surroundings. Upon entering Lee Chapel, I came across a small plaque, pictured here, honoring a Washington and Lee alumnus by the name of Kiffin Yates Rockwell, who, the plaque indicated, had been killed in aerial combat in France in September of 1916. Because my wife was then 8.5 months pregnant with our first child, baby names were at the front of our minds, and I believed I had just come across the coolest name ever. But what was the bearer of that name doing in France in 1916 in aerial combat, no less? I knew next to nothing about World War I, but I knew that we had not entered the war until 1917. During the next few years, I tried to learn more about this boy named Kiffin and how he came to be fighting and dying in France during the time that the United States was officially neutral and President Woodrow Wilson was campaigning for re-election using the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Through sporadic research over the years, I learned the basic outlines of a remarkable story. Long before their own country entered the conflict that would redefine the world, a handful of young American men ignored President Wilson's declared neutrality and risked their lives fighting on the side of France and, as they saw it, civilization itself. Initially stationed in the trenches, many of these idealistic volunteers eventually took to the skies as part of the first generation of fighter pilots. Many of these boys came from some of the wealthiest and most privileged families in America and willingly sacrificed everything to repay what they saw as a debt owed to France based on the heroic actions and support of the Marquis de Lafayette when America was engaged in its struggle for independence from Britain. Kiffin Rockwell was one of these boys, and with his brother Paul, in early August of 1914, he was likely the very first volunteer to leave America's shores to defend France. While many history buffs are familiar with the broad outlines of the story of the Lafayette Escadrille, as the All-American Flying Squadron would eventually become known, I was amazed to learn of the noble sacrifices made by these boys who had everything to lose. But as a practicing attorney with young children and a very busy life, my interest in the story never advanced beyond a general desire to know more. That all changed when, in 2014, my son was born on the exact 100-year anniversary of the day that Kiffin and Paul Rockwell enlisted in the Foreign Legion in Paris. We named our little boy Kiffin, and my interest in the story was rekindled. I began 5 years of research and writing that truly changed my life. Working at nights, on weekends, and during my daily commute to downtown Chicago, where I still practice law, I began to uncover the details of the remarkable story of the boys who remembered Lafayette, as I had begun to think of them. As I unearthed the letters, journals, and contemporary accounts of these boys, I was struck by their noble courage in the face of what most bluntly acknowledged would likely lead to their death, repaying the sacrifice of Lafayette. Piecing together their individual accounts, I began to realize what a remarkable story I had on my hands. A story that deserved to be told, a story of which all Americans could justly be proud. Indeed, it became clear to me that this handful of boys had helped galvanize their neutral countrymen to action. As the world's first fighter pilots, the boys were lionized in both the Paris and the American press, and their influence played a real and important role in America's eventual decision to enter the struggle for civilization on the side of its longtime ally, France. A good number of the boys, including Kiffin, proved the strength of their convictions by dying for France. In fact, Kiffin Rockwell lies buried in a small French town near the Swiss border under the flags of both France and America. Researching and writing this book opened an entire new world to me as I grasped the enormity of the conflict in which civilization itself was at stake. I learned of the almost unbelievable sacrifice of France and gained a newfound respect for the French people. But most of all, I learned the true story of some remarkable American boys and of how the principled actions of a few individuals can influence the tide of world events. President Woodrow Wilson's belated declaration of war, following that, well over 1 million American soldiers would cross the Atlantic to help save France. All of them followed in the footsteps of Kiffin Rockwell. I think every American should know and be proud of the boys who remembered Lafayette. Undying Greatness tells their remarkable story and provides an additional perspective on our country's entry and participation in the Great War. I hope it also reminds readers of the debt that we Americans owe to Lafayette and France for our own liberty and of how an individual acting on principle can make his own destiny. To understand why Kiffin Rockwell was in France long before his own country entered the fray, you need to know a little about his family background and ancestry. On both his maternal and paternal sides, Kiffin's lineage had strong military and religious traditions, usually skipping generations. So his family tree goes something like this on both sides: preacher, soldier, preacher, soldier, preacher, soldier. This tells you a little bit about the events that were taking place during those times as well. Kiffin's older brother, Paul, noted that, quote, "There have been soldiers in my family in every war as far back as I can trace. And it was once stated that for the Rockwells, soldiering was a family art and patriotism a family passion." Kiffin has strong ties to North Carolina. His ancestors lived down near Whiteville, and the book will tell you all about his genealogy if you're into that sort of thing. His mother, Lula, was also a remarkable woman. Once she was widowed when her husband died, she went to medical school and became probably, I believe I've confirmed this through my research, at least to my own satisfaction, that she was probably the first licensed female osteopathic physician in the state of North Carolina and practiced for something like 50 years over in Asheville, and raised Kiffin, Paul, and their sister Agnes by herself. Lula was so upset when her son's growing fame hit the papers, and they suggested that her boys were from Atlanta. In letters to her son, she insisted that they set the record straight and let everyone know that North Carolina claimed them for its own. Kiffin himself had spent many summers swimming in the rivers south of here, down by Whiteville, and went to church in his youth at Bear Swamp Baptist Church, just across the South Carolina border. In fact, Kiffin's father was a Baptist preacher here in North Carolina. And as I alluded to a moment ago, he died shortly before Kiffin's first birthday. So Kiffin did not have a father, but he did have a legacy of his father and of his grandfathers on both sides, and his long lineage of which he was well aware. Even in his youth, Kiffin's father, whose name was James Chester Rockwell, he went by the initials JC, was published as a poet in numerous North Carolina papers. And by the time he was 17 years old, he ran his own newspaper that he had purchased and published it on his own, I think in Raleigh. and I took part of the book's title from an editorial that Kiffin's father wrote when he was 17 years old. And that editorial began with the bold statement, very indicative of the mindset of Kiffin and his ancestry. Every man should make his own destiny. That was his sort of thesis statement in a newspaper editorial. He then went on to say, this is kind of flowery language, but you have to take it for, 1890 or whenever he wrote it. But here's what he said. "O man, be up and doing. Laugh down the foolish idea that you are but a helpless reed in the hands of a fickle destiny. Scorn the thought that you cannot do noble things simply because fate says you must not. Be true to yourself and to humanity, and you make for yourself a destiny of undying greatness and grandeur." That sentiment seemed to me to sum up Kiffin and his ancestry rather well. So I'll try to leave it at that without getting to too much more of his ancestry. But you should know that Kiffin and Paul were both raised to revere the Marquis de Lafayette. And at the time, he was viewed as on a par with the founding fathers. And I suppose I should mention, at the time, the founding fathers were viewed as something worthy of idealizing, and that they were men of courage and foresight. I still feel that way. There are many who do not, but Lafayette was always viewed as on the same plane with those great men. And Paul once said that he had, quote, "learned as soon as I could read to be grateful to France and to Lafayette and his French comrades." Now, I won't tell you anything more about their ancestry, but it is true that the boys were in Atlanta when World War I broke out. And Paul was working for a newspaper down there called the Atlanta Journal. That newspaper ran, this is just a snippet of that article. It went on a little longer, but it noted that they had telegraphed to the French consul in New Orleans offering to enlist as soldiers of France in the war against Germany. This was, those of you who are aware of the timeline know this was immediately and it was true. I did actually run down the telegram that they had sent to the French consulate. That was provided to me by the French consulate, which had kept it in their records all these years. Paul always said that he when his book, he signed Kiffin's name to it and made it sound like Kiffin had sent this telegram, but Paul actually signed it. And that kind of plays through a lot of how Paul viewed Kiffin. He always tried to put Kiffin in the best light. I don't think he made any, made any huge mistakes or anything, but Kiffin's ideals could stand on their own, but Paul was always looking out for him. Another paper, the Greenville News, I told you I practiced law in Greenville, so it was interesting to find an article from the Greenville News dated 2 days after this on August 6th, reported that Kiffin and Paul had ancestors who had fought under Lafayette, which is also true. I confirmed through my research. And they wished to enlist in the French army, but the newspaper said, quote, they would probably be arrested if they made an attempt to leave the country on such a mission. And that was not just idle speculation. The same paper here, the Atlanta Journal, that this article appeared in on August 4th, if you turn the page, there was another article that talked about how President Wilson had just issued a proclamation of American neutrality, forbidding American citizens from, quote, enlisting or entering into the service of either of the said belligerents as a soldier or in any other capacity. Wilson later declared that the country must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that try men's souls. Paul Rockwell later recalled that although Wilson had declared his neutrality and we risked losing our citizenship, all they could do was threaten you. That didn't do any good, he said. And so despite President Wilson's proclamation on neutrality, the boys immediately hurried to New York City to catch one of the last American flag ships leaving for Europe and war. After arriving in New York City late the night of August 6th, Kiffin dashed off a quick letter to his mother, telling her, you know, I have always been a great dreamer, and I just couldn't keep myself from going on this trip, for I felt the call of opportunity. The next morning, the boys boarded an ocean liner and crossed the Atlantic, passed through London, and arrived in Paris on the morning of October 26th, 1914. Now imagine for a minute Paris in August of 1914. Everywhere men were enlisting, trains were rolling, machines were humming, flags were waving. As one observer at the time put it, there never was a thrill like the early days of August 1914 in Paris. That day's English language New York Herald, which was the English language paper in Paris, ran this photo, captioned "The Departure of the American Volunteers." A group of Americans in Paris, calling themselves the American Volunteer Corps, had come together to recruit volunteers to fight for France. They set up an office on the Rue des Valois and sent out several appeals for volunteers in the leading papers in Paris and London. Soon, adventurers and volunteers began streaming in from all quarters. Many American students and university men were in Paris for their studies or for business reasons and volunteered out of a desire to aid France. Their aim was to enlist with the French Foreign Legion. As one reporter noted, many of the Americans, quote, proposed in small measure to repay the service Lafayette rendered the United States. So again, at that time, there were plenty of American young men, plenty in Paris, that felt like they needed to sign up because we owed it to France and to Lafayette. When they came together for training, the leader, one of the leaders of the group, explained it this way: "We meant to fight for France. We loved France. Something in each of us, voiceless and confused as we were, told us that the world would be the gainer if France won, and immeasurably the lower if France were crushed. I do not know that many of us carried the argument further." The volunteers purchased the largest and best American flag they could find in Paris, a 4-foot beauty, but with only 44 stars, 4 fewer than the number of states at that time, and hung it over the door of the recruiting office. This picture, as I said, appeared in that morning's edition of the New York Herald. So when Kiffin and Paul arrived in Paris, this was likely the paper that they saw, and I'm sure they saw that photo. It's a picture of the group of Americans as they marched down the Avenue de l'Opera towards the train station where they were to leave for the front. And you can see here the American flag. And if you looked at it real close, you would see that there's like 5 total rows. There's 9 stars in each one, except for the middle one closest to the pole. There's only 8. There's only 44 stars. There were 48 states at that time, but the best flag they could find in Paris on short notice only had 44. There's another flag right behind it, another American flag, and the stories were that they carried 2 of them. A lot of the stories say that these gentlemen, one of these guys is Rene Felizeau, that I'll tell you a little bit about. And this guy behind him, you might have heard his name, was Alan Seeger. He claimed to have carried one of these flags, and I imagine that they traded off as they went. It was a pretty good walk. They also had a French flag, which I think is in between these flags here, but you can't see it on the photo. We'll talk a little bit more about that flag too. The one that had 44 stars on it. Let's go on to that. This is that flag, and this is a photo of it sometime later. And you might say, what is that stuff on it? Well, let me tell you a little bit about Rene Felizeau and how this came about. Rene Felizeau was born in France to a French father, but raised on Division Street in Chicago by his Irish-American mother. He was an adventurous sort, to put it mildly. At the age of 13, he ran away to be a cabin boy on a Mississippi River passenger boat. And at 15, he worked his way across the Atlantic on a freight steamer to France. In my research, I even came across one record that listed him as a 19-year-old stowaway on a boat from Liverpool to Boston. Felizeau studied engineering. He worked at U.S. Steel, and he joined the Illinois Naval Reserve before he drifted into the Congo district, where he made his name as a big game hunter and ivory trader. So he had a lot of money. One of the leaders of the volunteers, he was one of the men that organized this group as well in Paris. Felizeau was a real character, and he was well liked by all the men. His actions helped transform the flag they carried that day down the avenue in Paris into a lasting symbol of sacrifice for the Americans. On September 1st, when the volunteers were ordered to further training at Toulouse, France, Fayetteville had each of the American volunteers sign it. Although you can't make out the writing very well, the writing states American Volunteer Corps, September 1, 1914. It's on the white stripes there. You can't see it in this photo very well. And they each signed their names to it. And I think that's a pretty significant thing, that these American boys were there fighting for France, but I think most of them viewed it as a debt to Lafayette, yes, but they felt that even though their country was neutral and was not paying its debt, they were going to pay their part. And that by signing this flag, I felt like they were entering into a contract almost, like, we're going to do this on behalf of America. And so they all signed this flag. Then when the boys were sent to the front after their training, almost 8 weeks later, their French officers ordered all the foreign flags to be discarded so as not to cause any international complications if the boys were captured. Disobeying the order, Fayetteville folded the flag and wound it around his waist, wearing it in that fashion until he died on March 6, 1915. You can read more about that tragedy in my book, but one interesting thing is that, you know, he kept that flag on his body throughout his service there in the Foreign Legion. And just before his death, the half delirious Fayetteville rose up in his hospital bed, held the flag up over his head, and exclaimed, "I am an American." Then he collapsed dead. And that sounds kind of too good to be true kind of thing. And I've saw several sources for it, though, where several people said, yeah, that's what happened. And I can see it from a guy like that he was there on behalf of America to pay this debt. And he wanted it to be known just before he died that he was an American. Now, is that heroic and noble or what? It is. The flag was then carried by others in the American contingent and eventually made its way back to Paris. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I've got to condense some of this. So, I mean, the book is probably 700 and some pages, including all the footnotes and everything. So nobody's ever actually going to read it. And I know that, and I'm okay with it. But long story short, a lot of these boys were in the Foreign Legion, and they came from various places and locations to come together. And then there was this new thing out there called aviation, and planes were progressing very rapidly, from bombers and you know, where they would float out over the lines and observe things, and then they started dropping bombs. Then they started waving at each other. Some of the accounts say they threw some bricks at each other. Then they started carrying handguns and shooting at each other. And then somebody got the bright idea to put a gun on it. They put another guy behind them to fire. Then they put a machine gun on there, and you couldn't fire the machine gun through the propellers. You had to shoot it out the side. Then they came up with a gear that allowed you to shoot through the propellers. All this was happening very rapidly. And some of these boys were trying to get into aviation. I'll tell you a little bit about how that came about. But one boy I want you to focus on here is all the way on the, whoops, I'm hitting the wrong button. See that guy right there on the left? Jim McConnell. He's a North Carolina boy too, so I thought I would highlight him. He was one of Kiffin's very good friends when they eventually got into the aviation, and this group was formed called the Escadrille Americaine. I should have put an E on the end of that. I think I misspelled the Americaine there, sorry. The American Squadron. And Jim McConnell was a fun-loving jokester kind of guy from the university. He had gone to the University of Virginia. He originally volunteered as in the American Ambulance Service, which was another contingent of American boys that went over to volunteer in the American Ambulance Service, which became the Red Cross. McConnell was born in Chicago, which I always thought was a nice tie. His father was a Cook County judge there, and his son was General John McConnell, his father was the son of General John McConnell, who was a Union cavalry officer during the Civil War. And Paul Rockwell always used to say, well, Jim McConnell's granddaddy was a Union general, but he's a Southerner. Like Paul Rockwell was always like Mr. Southern, and always felt like he had to point out that McConnell was not actually, his sympathy was not like a Yankee, which I don't know how certain I am about that, but that's what Paul Rockwell always said. Well, Jim grew up in Chicago. He moved to New York and then left the University of Virginia and came down to North Carolina. Hank Parfit and I were just over in Carthage, North Carolina this morning, where there's a museum over there dedicated to Mr. McConnell, and an airfield and some nice murals and statues. McConnell was one of my favorites of the boys because he had such an active mind and he was an excellent writer. And he wrote a book about what happened there called Flying for France, and it's very well written. And you can tell that he actually wrote it when you read his letters. His letters, which you think are like, the first drafts of history, and they are in this instance, his letters were just like his book. I think he took his letters and turned them into a book. And that's how good of a writer he was. It just jumps out to you. And he made these experiences real. Well, he was in Carthage, North Carolina, working as a land agent for a railroad company, and decided that this war that was taking place, he needed to be a part of it. He told some of his friends, they quoted him as saying, "These sand hills will be here forever, but the war won't, and so I'm going." And he left in January of 1915 to join the ambulance service. He stayed in the ambulance service and won the Croix de Guerre for his bravery there in rescuing a French soldier. And then eventually he met Paul Rockwell. I actually think that he was one of the ambulance guys that came and picked up Paul Rockwell when Paul Rockwell got bronchitis, and that they met that way. And then he became friends with Kiffin. And then he heard about this thing called aviation and sort of tipped into that. He wrote a letter in November of 2015 telling his friend that he was going to resign from the ambulance service. And he said, "You see, I thought it all out and figured that the decent thing for me to do was to fight." In a letter to his superior at the American Ambulance, he said this: "I have decided to go into the French Army. I shall be in the aviation corps, and if successful, will become a pilot. I've been thinking the matter over for a long time. I feel as strongly about the war as the French themselves. I believe it to be a war of freedom and civilization against despotic dictation and hideous ideals. And having this attitude, I want to give up my capacity as a neutral, as a member of the Red Cross, and go into the fighting end." Well, he did go into the fighting end, and that's when the French finally, you can read about all that in the book, it took them a while, but they finally got the idea that to form this squadron of Americans would be to their advantage. And so this is the first day that the Americans, or this is the first post that the Americans were posted, and they took this picture with those first four that had shown up. That is Jim McConnell. That's Kiffin Rockwell. This is their French commander, George Taino. That's Norman Prince, who I'll tell you a little bit about, and that's Victor Chapman. Incredible boys. McConnell would eventually die. He was the last American to die before America entered the war. He fell behind the German lines in March of 1917. At his memorial service in Paris on April 2nd, 1917, which was when the American Congress was debating declaring war, the bishop there spoke to the assembled congregation of McConnell's sacrifice and reminded them, quote, "how impossible it is to put an end to a really fine life." I think that's a nice quote. And that's what we gain by remembering, is that it's impossible to put an end to a really fine life. One who admired both Kiffin and Jim McConnell, she was served as sort of like a second mother to them over in Paris, wrote a letter to the editor of the Asheville Citizen with these words about her favorite boys. And they were both dead by this time. And you can see how your typical Americans that were involved there felt about things. Part of what she wrote was this: these men have done all they could for France, but they have done a greater thing for their own country in keeping the bonds between the two countries strong, and in not forgetting the debt we owed to France, without whose aid we might never have been. Again, this idea of a debt. And so many people felt that debt 100 years ago. Let's talk quickly about Alan Seeger. I took these photos out of a video, there's a video that exists of this, and you're probably saying, what is that? It's a statue in a place in Paris called the Place des Etats Unis, the Place of the United States. This was May 30th, 1916. May 30th used to be called Decoration Day, and now it's Memorial Day, and it's the first Monday or last Monday, last Monday in May. But it used to be May 30th every year, and it was celebrated, and you decorate the graves of the soldiers that had died. Well, when the squadron had just been formed, the Parisians came out in force and met in the Place of the United States on Decoration Day, because there's this statue there at the end of the park. It's a statue of Lafayette and Washington. I don't know if you can see it very well, but that's Lafayette on the left, and that's Washington. You can't make it out very well because it's covered in flowers. And they were literally, if you see the video of this, there was people just bringing big flotillas of flowers and draping them and dropping them off. Alan Seeger, who some of you may have heard of, was one of the Americans that was in Kiffin's unit in the Foreign Legion. And he was a Harvard graduate that was living in the Latin Quarter of Paris when the war broke out. He ended up in that same unit with Kiffin and Paul and some other Americans in the Foreign Legion. And you might know his nephew, Pete Seeger, who became like a famous folk singer. And others might know Alan Seeger for a famous poem that he wrote, probably the most famous American poem of World War I, and a favorite of John F. Kennedy, called Rendezvous. It begins with these lines: I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade. When spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air, I have a rendezvous with death when spring brings back blue days and fair. That's just the beginning, but it's a pretty famous poem. And I think a lot of these boys felt they had a rendezvous with death, and they were okay with it. They felt like they were going to pay this debt, and if it cost them their lives, they were okay with it. And Seeger certainly felt that way. He wrote that poem like in 1915 at some point, I think. And through my research, I won't tell you this whole story. It's spelled out pretty good in the book, I think. But that story, or the line, I have a rendezvous with death at some disputed barricade, I think is because of an event that happened with him and Kiffin Rockwell when they were serving on sentry duty just off the lines in a burned out, shelled town called Crayonel, France, where they were on guard duty, just Kiffin and Alan Seeger. And they got attacked and overrun by a German patrol, and both of them should have died, and neither of them did. And they both wrote letters home afterwards saying, I can't believe that I'm alive. And shortly thereafter, Alan Seeger had this mindset that he was going to die, and that he wrote that poem, I have a rendezvous with death. And I found it really strange or cool and neat that this poem that I knew turned out, I'm convinced that it was because of that night that he was on guard duty with Kiffin Rockwell. And you can read about that, but I want to talk just real briefly about another poem that Alan Seeger wrote that is not nearly as famous, but probably deserves to be, certainly among fans of Lafayette. Back to the May 30th Decoration Day in Paris, they had invited Alan Seeger to write a poem to be read at this event. And he wrote this poem, and he was still out fighting in the trenches and everything, but you can read in his letters in his diary how much this meant to him, that he wanted to be a poet. That's what he was doing in Paris. This was his big chance. And he wrote out this poem that he was going to get to read in Paris on Decoration Day. Well, a military, typical bureaucratic mix-up resulted in him not getting the leave, and he couldn't read his poem there that day. So he felt awful, and you can read in his letters that he was like, I can't, he said it was shorn of all can't remember the word, but he felt like, gosh, my poem that I poured myself into, nobody's ever going to hear it. Well, it is a masterpiece, and a lot of people hear it now because that poem is actually printed on the side of a plinth that's put there now, a big foundation with a statue of Alan Seeger on top of it, and it has all the American volunteers etched into it. They put it up there in 1923, and on the sides they put some of the words, and I'd like to share some of those with you. And part of his poem, which Seeger called an ode in memory of the American volunteers fallen for France, he wrote, or he spoke of the higher cause, the exalted volunteers who had given a few brave drops and died for that fair country, France. He loved France. And to those who wondered of indifferent America, quote, if her manhood be decreased, Seeger answered to remember the small number of citizens like himself who had not forgotten their country's antique debt owed to France. He wrote, be proud of these, have joy in this at least, and cry, now heaven be praised, that in that hour that most imperiled her, menaced her liberty who foremost raised Europe's bright flag of freedom. Some there were who, not unmindful of the antique debt, came back the generous path of Lafayette. I've always thought that was a really neat turn of phrase. And he was saying, those of you who think that America is not meeting its obligation, don't forget about us. We are here, and we did come back like Lafayette, and we are paying that debt. And he wasn't able to read it there himself, but like I said, it's been read many times. After the war, they put up that memorial, and on the sides, it has some further words of it. And here's what one side of the plinth reads. Hail, brothers, and farewell. You are twice blessed, brave hearts. Double your glory is who perished thus, for you have died for France and vindicated us. And again, it's this idea of paying this debt and be willing to pay this debt. And Seeger certainly was. He died shortly after writing that poem on the 4th of July in 1916, fighting for France. Norman Prince, I want to tell you just briefly about, because it was his idea to start the squadron. While Kiffin and Paul and some of the boys had joined the Foreign Legion and come from America, others had been in Paris and they joined. And so these people were coming from all these different places. Well, Norman Prince, he was another idealistic American. And like Kiffin, he believed that there was a debt owed to France through Lafayette. To say that he came from wealth would be an understatement. He was the son of Frederick Henry Prince, the investment banker, financier, and industrialist. Frederick was one of the richest men in America, having earned his vast wealth investing in the stockyards, slaughterhouses, and meatpacking operations that grew up around Chicago at the turn of the century. This was real wealth. I think it still is real wealth. That's how much wealth we're talking about. A guest at one of the Prince family mansions once joked that Mr. Prince, quote, served champagne at luncheon, tea, and dinner. It's hard to say why he discriminates against breakfast. Norman was quite handsome. You can see in this photo, I think he had the poise of an athlete. He graduated from Harvard and then earned his law degree from Harvard Law. Altogether, a pilot, racer, sportsman, polo player, and lawyer, Nimmy Prince, as his friends called him, was a brash, confident gent. One French publication later described him as young, rich, and full of vigor. This photo is of him from the front page of the Boston Globe when he received his aviator's license in 1911. And I love the photo there. You can just see this like, idealistic youth kind of thing. And he was this rich kid, but a rich kid with actual talent and ideals. He became an aviator, and his father didn't want any part of it because he was a trained lawyer. So he sent him off to Chicago to work for Winston, Payne, Strawn, and Shaw, which is even today one of the biggest law firms in the world. Now it's just called Winston and Strawn. But Prince's heart was never really in it, and he spent most of his time playing polo, racing horses and automobiles, hanging out at country clubs, and trying to organize teams to enter flight competitions sponsored by Chicago aviation clubs. When the war broke out, Norman told a friend, quote, "The decent thing for us to do is to go over there and help them what little we as individuals can." Again, his father didn't want him to. And so one of the stories that is told is that he set aside, and he kept giving his secretary, Norman would give his secretary $5 at a time until he set aside a couple $100, and then he absconded for France. Now remember, he had money coming out of his ears, and the fact that he had to supposedly set it aside like that shows that his father and his mother particularly didn't want anything to do with it, but he felt that he owed it. He had come up with a plan to start an all-American flying squadron to assist France. He went over to France in January of 1915 and tried to get anybody who would listen to buy his idea of getting this American squadron. No one would listen, but eventually he and a couple other Americans were able to convince the French to go forward. This wasn't until after he and two other boys had gotten into the French aviation service on their own and become somewhat famous back in America. And the French realized that, hey, we can get some mileage out of this. Maybe that squadron is a good idea. So after he and two other pilots had come back to America for Christmas in 1915, when they came back to France in 1916, France had a whole different outlook and thought this is a good idea. When they left the American shores, and there was a whole controversy about them coming home that you can read in the book, where they were talking about arresting these boys and all the controversy in America about these guys fighting in a foreign war and they should be interned and all that. They weren't. And when they left, a reporter on the ship asked Norman Prince directly what were his motives for joining with the French. And here's what Norman Prince said: "I enlisted because we in America owe such a debt to France as can never be paid. My country may have forgotten what Lafayette and Rochambeau and all the rest did for us when we were in dire need, but some of us have not forgotten." Well, they got the squadron going, and Norman Prince eventually gave his life as well for France when he was shot down in October of 1916. We do have to talk a little bit about death because all these boys ended up dying. I shouldn't say all of them, but the ones I'm talking about all did. And this is a photo of Paul Rockwell at his brother's crash site a few days after he was brought down in aerial combat. Victor Chapman, who was a good friend of Kiffin Rockwell, had been shot down in June of 1916. Kiffin was shot down in September. And as I said, Norman Prince then followed in October. You can see here in this picture, I think it well captures like the awful grief that Paul felt at the time. And Paul still had his pride in Kiffin, and he wrote this letter to a friend shortly after the death: "No one ever had a dearer brother and truer friend than I had, and when Kiffin fell, something went out of my life that can never return in this world. But Kiffin went so bravely and so willingly for what he knew to be right that I can only attempt to bear his loss with a courage worthy of him. His life was full of fine deeds, if not of long years, and since fate willed that he die young, I am glad that it was fighting for France and humanity that he met his death." And again, that echoes how a lot of these folks felt at the time, that it was okay that they died because they were doing it in service of a higher cause. And you might say, well, that's his brother and his grief's understandable, and maybe he's inflating the importance of it all. And maybe he was, but there were people in high positions that took note of the death of Kiffin Rockwell. It was all over the American papers. The French ambassador to the United States sent a telegram to Kiffin's mother and wrote this: "All France mourns with you. Your son will live forever in the hearts of the French people." Former President Teddy Roosevelt was quoted as saying that Kiffin had been, quote, "true to American ideals, and that every American owes him a debt because by his example, he has helped this nation to save its own soul." Here in North Carolina, I wanted to touch on one point that there was an editorial written by, I think, by a gentleman named W.A. Hildebrand, who was the editor of the Greensboro News. He had at one time published the Asheville Citizen, and I think he surely had to know some folks that were in Kiffin's adopted hometown. He wrote this 2 days after Kiffin's death, and remember that Victor Chapman had died just a couple months before Kiffin. And here's what he said, and this again is a good sentiment of how people thought at this time. "Yesterday, only ordinary American boys with little to distinguish them from the mass of their fellows. Today, they are legendary heroes of two nations. One stride through the opal gates has carried Rockwell into the company of Lafayette. He is a man transfigured from an ordinary North Carolina boy into a martyr of liberty in the eyes of the French, and into the coin in which we have paid for Lafayette in the eyes of his own countrymen." Then he said, "In years to come, when old men who fought in the War of 1916 grope back in their memories for outstanding incidents of the collision to which Verdun has given its name, they may forget how many thousands of guns were employed. They may forget the fury of the assaults. They may forget how many of their own countrymen lie buried in the field. But they will remember that among the dead were two young foreigners come of their own free will out of democratic America to fight for democratic France. Living, Rockwell and Chapman were only two adventurous youths. Dead, they are links that bind more closely the two greatest republics of the world. Living, they accomplished only microscopic things in the elemental struggle about them. Dead, they have accomplished what all the Kaiser's men and all the Kaiser's guns in 25 months have not been able to do. They have made France bow her head." Well, that's a pretty powerful editorial. But even more powerful was the fact that these deaths actually led, I think, to America entering into the war and coming in just in the nick of time. Many have commented about, that France was wearing itself out. England was wearing itself out. The submarine warfare that had been reinstituted was causing carnage, and America came in just in time, I think, because of the actions of these boys. Well, on the 4th of July in 1917, American troops had begun arriving in France in June, and on the 4th of July, Paris had an official welcome. In the Invalides, this big museum in the center of Paris, the Reverend Samuel N. Watson of the American Church stepped forward to present the banner carried by the first American volunteers in the Foreign Legion. This was the same flag that had hung over the offices of the American Volunteer Corps, that Alan Seeger and Rene Felizeau had carried down the Avenue de l'Opera, and that they had all signed on September 1st, 1914, when they were sent to the front. It was the flag that Felizeau had raised up just before he died, proclaiming, "I am an American." The crowd fell silent as Reverend Watson stepped forward and spoke to General Pershing. He said, "It is my privilege, General, as representing our American legionnaires, those Americans who for the love of France and of liberty entered the French army in 1914, to present to France this flag, their flag, and our flag. They were the pioneers of that great American army which is coming following your lead as their general. And now they, the advance guard, are leaving to you and to your troops the task which they began so bravely. Now your new standard will replace their bullet-pierced flag, whilst theirs is confided to France, whom they loved with deathless eagerness." And remember, this was the flag that they had all signed, and it says something that when the American troops showed up in numbers, they felt the need to give this flag and sort of pass the torch to General Pershing. And he wrote about it in his personal memoirs. Paris was going crazy that day for the Americans. And here's what one American described the pandemonium of this procession as these soldiers marched through Paris. Wrote this to his mother back home. "I never saw such a demonstration. Everywhere were American flags. Paris was wild, frantic. I never saw anything like it. They are crazy over the Americans. Viva l'Amérique seems to be still buzzing in my ears. I can't begin to describe the wonderful effect our declaration of war has had on the French. It has given them new courage. We came in at the psychological moment. France weeps for happiness, cheers for joy, rekindles her spirit, and cries, Viva l'Amérique." That shows the timing of this was just in time. And if these boys had not done what they did, it might not have happened. Well, they had to march through Paris, and let's see if this plays. I think this is the last slide. There we go. This all happened on the 4th of July. You see there at the museum trading these flags. I don't think that was the actual flag on the pole, but they did accept the flag. Then they presented the colors, and you'll see the army marching out here. I'll talk a little bit as it goes, but they marched through Paris, and the reason they marched through Paris is they had one more place to go. They had to go to the cemetery at Picpus to see the grave of Lafayette. Eventually, as they marched through Paris, they reached the high-walled cemetery, and after a few brief remarks, you'll see some of this at the very end, the time was turned over to the Americans. General Pershing had delegated the task of speaking to his aide, Colonel Charles E. Stanton. That's General Pershing there. I could never find any video, and I don't know that it exists, of actually Charles Stanton speaking. But this was what I referenced at the beginning, the famous Lafayette We Are Here speech. That speech is remembered for its ending, but his opening, Colonel Stanton's opening, strikes me as equally important. He said when he first stepped up, "The fact cannot be forgotten that your nation was our friend when America was struggling for existence, when a handful of brave and patriotic people were determined to uphold the rights their creator gave them, that France, in the person of Lafayette, came to our aid in words and deed. It would be ingratitude not to remember this, and America defaults no obligations." Then he went through the reasons that compelled the United States to enter the war, and he closed by saying, "America has joined forces with the Allied powers, and what we have of blood and treasure are yours. Therefore, it is with loving pride that we drape the colors in tribute of respect to this citizen of your great republic. And here and now, in the shadow of the illustrious dead, we pledge our heart and our honor in carrying this war to a successful issue. Lafayette, we are here." Well, in my view, the boys had prepared the American mind and the American public to enter World War I. As their French commander, Georges Thénault, put it, the deaths of Kiffin and his comrades aroused their compatriots from the doubt of neutrality to a comprehension of the vital issues at stake. The sacrifice of their young lives stirred their countrymen beyond all argument of words. Theirs was the propaganda by deeds, and they won out. The flag they signed on September 1st, 1914 is still on display in the Museum des Invalides. About the only signatures that are still visible are Paul and Kiffin Rockwell. Two boys from North Carolina. All Americans should know of these boys and feel a sense of pride in their deeds in saving France and civilization. Today is Lafayette's birthday, a particularly fitting day to remember these boys and to resist the willed amnesia of our age. Let us each become one who remembers. Lincoln's famous speech at Gettysburg, he talked about how the world would little note or long remember what he had said, but they could never forget what those men had done there. I feel the same way about these boys and think that, like them, we should remember Lafayette. We should never forget these boys and what they did or why they did it. I hope that my book serves as something of a monument to these boys. And my old college roommate told me when he ordered the book, and then he called me up and said, "What am I supposed to do with this?" Because it's a big, thick book. He said, "I got your book today. What am I supposed to do with it?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Is it a doorstop?" So maybe it's not a doorstop. Maybe it's its own little monument. It's heavy enough and weighty enough. But I would like it if some people see it as weighty in another sense. That, as Professor Boersma stated of the soon-to-be unveiled National World War I Memorial in D.C., it, quote, serves to resist the willed amnesia of our age. Let us do all we can to remake our age into one that prefers to remember and to never forget. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
I think I explained it all pretty thoroughly, right? There's a question over here. Maybe you can come to the mic, or a mic can come to you.
No. I'll bring it.
Afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Did those gentlemen stay only in the Western Front, or did they have any area during Arabia, since they were connected with the Foreign Legion?
What was the last part about the Foreign Legion?
That since the Foreign Legion was primarily in Egypt, or if they're in Arabia, would they're connected over there, or they primarily fought in the Western Front?
These boys all fought in the Western Front with the Foreign Legion. Not all of them fought with the Foreign Legion. Kiffin did, and Paul did. Victor Chapman did. Several of the others that came up into aviation did, and they fought on the Western Front with the Foreign Legion. The poem that I told you that Alan Seeger wrote was the poem that he wrote about when they were on the Western Front and had that brush with death in Crayonnel, France, which was on the Western Front. All these boys stayed on the Western Front, but there was some talk at various points about getting transfers to different places on the Eastern Front and to Africa, maybe even to Italy. Kiffin was, when they were waiting for aviation to finally get going, they were all saying, "What the heck is going on? Are we ever going to get in there?" And Kiffin was trying to get in with any unit that he could so that he could go to the front as a pilot. And he even requested, I think he put in something with his superior to try to get transferred to, I'll say it, I don't remember if it was Italy or somewhere, or Greece, but he was just like, put me somewhere so I can fight. And then shortly after that was when the squadron was formed. And then after that, they all stuck with that and then died. But yeah, good question. It was all the Western Front. I think maybe some Americans might have ended up more on the Eastern Front somewhere, but all these boys that became friends and hung around Paris and sort of worked around that hub was all the Western Front.
Thank you.
Yeah. There's a question over here, I think, first, Dan, and then up here in the front.
About how many people were in this first group, this first flying group?
When the squadron was formed in April of 1916, there were 7 American boys, and they had the 2 French commanders. One was in that photo that I showed you, George Taino, and there was a Sioux lieutenant whose name was Alfred Delage de Meaux, and he was a French officer as well. And below them, there were 7 Americans.
I have 2 more questions. Was it only one unit, or were there other units?
It was just one unit. It was N-124, which stood for Newport 124. They flew the Newports, and so their unit was actually probably the first like fighter squadron organized around these chase planes, these combat planes. They flew those Newport 11s, which were these nimble little planes that could maneuver and push back on the Fokkers that were sort of dominating the sky at that time. And it was really the first combat pilots in the world was this squadron. There were Newports and some of the other French squadrons, but the French were a little jealous when the American squadron that came in got all Newports, and these Americans got all the Newports and a lot of the attention too, not just in America, but in France. They pushed this as a very big deal. They even brought a movie outfit out to their very first post and filmed them all. That's why we have some of those photos, and there's actual video. If you go to my website here at Undying Greatness, you can link to some of the video of these boys, and they released it as a movie in America. The movie was called Our American Boys in the European War. And so these guys kind of became like movie stars as well.
I imagine there were more than 7 when the United States finally entered the war. But did all of these gentlemen who were fighting for France join the Army Air Corps when America joined the war?
No, many of them did, and many of them became leaders in the Air Corps. And certainly America was a little behind the ball when they got in. And there's another gentleman that wrote a book about how these Americans sort of was the basis for the formation of the American Air Force. I think that's probably true, that without the experience of all these boys coming there and flying and fighting, the American Air Force would not have formed then. But when America entered the war, most of the boys, I believe, transferred over, but there were some who said, I'm staying with France, and stuck it out that way. But I think most of them did transfer over to American. Remember, a lot of them died as well, too. The original group that I'm talking about, Bill Thaw was a famous pilot. He transferred over and became a major and commanded, I think, the Hat in the Ring 94th Squadron that was the American squadron when they came in. And Raoul Lufberry, who shot down more planes than any other American, although I view him as a Frenchman. He was more of a Frenchman, but they labeled him American. He became a leader in the squadron as well, but then he got shot down in 1918.
While they were still under the French, were any of them African Americans?
There were, and there's actually an excellent book. There was a gentleman, I think his name was Eugene Bullard, who was in the Foreign Legion and was I think he was a boxer in Paris and rather famous. He joined the Foreign Legion, and then he became a pilot in the Escadrille. There's a whole nother book that came out maybe a year or so ago that's done very well, and it's a good book about him. He survived the war and went on to do many wonderful things. I think he ended up in Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. And there was an African-American gentleman in Kiffin and Paul's squadron in the Foreign Legion, whose name was Bob Scanlon. And the way they describe him is very interesting, because one of the boys described him as a black mountain of a man. And I just thought this was a big guy. And apparently he was a boxer too. And one time when Alan Seeger got into a fight with maybe one of the Italians or something in one of the other units, Bob Scanlon came over and apparently put an end to it by just blasting the guy and like knocked him out. And that was the end of that. But yeah, there were a few. And it seemed that even though a lot of these boys were from the South and that there was still segregation and everything, it seemed like that didn't carry over when they were in Paris and when they were out there fighting. And, I guess it was war and whatever individual characteristics, but they all seemed to get along and respect one another.
I assume, though, that they would not have been allowed to join the American Air Corps?
I don't know that for sure, but that's what I assume too.
Okay.
I don't know.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no other questions, once again, let's give Mark a big round of applause. And folks, we'd like to remind you that if you'd like to get a copy of his book, we have copies for sale just outside the door. And now's your chance to not only buy one, but get it autographed. Yes, Hank. Well, that's not so bad.
There are
Yes.
pictures.
Yeah, but now's your opportunity to get one. Also, I'd like to remind you of tonight's lecture at Methodist University for those who can make it. And also, let's not forget tomorrow's festivities that Gwen told us about earlier. Hope to see you all there, and thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
That was great, Mark.